All right, this is question 4, LargeFriend on the CS61B Spring 2025 Midterm 1. So this question asks us to fill in the code for the comparator LargeFriend. Its constructor should take in as input a comparator, wrapped comparator, which tells LargeFriend how to compare two items of type T. It should also be possible to iterate over LargeFriend, which will yield all items that have ever been judged as larger by the LargeFriend object. And so we have an example down here where we define a comparator and we provide that as input to our LargeFriend constructor. And now we can use the LargeFriend comparator in order to compare different objects like apple and zebra. And so we have the results down here. We also should be able to iterate through LargeFriend, right? So we can use the for loop here to loop through every word in LargeFriend that was have ever been judged as larger. And it should print out zebra, banana, zebra, since those were the words up here that were deemed as larger. If we add more comparisons, they should also get added in our iteration of LargeFriend. And so now moving on to the actual question where we have to implement the class. We have this class definition at the top, LargeFriend implements, and then we have two blanks over here, right? So thinking about what LargeFriend needs to do based on the question, LargeFriend has to be a comparator, right? Because it needs to compare these two objects that it gets as input. And so we know that has to be one of the interfaces that it implements down here. So we can write comparator. And since LargeFriend is a generic, it will also implement comparator as a generic. And then the second thing LargeFriend needs to do based on the question is be iterable, right? LargeFriend has to be able to be iterated over, remember, based on the question, so that we can return all the words that have been deemed larger. So it must also implement the iterable interface with the generic as well. And now we move on to the actual body of the class. So we define a instance variable wrapped comparator. And then we have another instance variable here, which we have to figure out what to do with. We don't really know right now, so we can come back to it later. We have a comparator, LargeFriend, which takes in a wrapped comparator as an input. And so remember, this was for the comparator that we can pass as an input that LargeFriend will use to actually compare the objects it receives. And so this should just directly go into the instance variable that we've defined. So we can do this dot wrapped comparator equals wrapped comparator. We have the second line here, which probably has to do with the second instance variable that we need to define. And so if we look at the behavior of the LargeFriend, we need to somehow keep track of which items have been judged as larger so that we can eventually return it when we iterate through LargeFriend. And so we can see when we're comparing all these items, we store zebra, banana, and then we store zebra again, and then that will print out zebra, banana, and zebra. And so a good way to do this would just be to store these items in a list and add them to our list as we do these comparisons. And then we can just iterate through the list to return everything in LargeFriend, right? So for the second instance variable, we can define a list. And this will also have to be generic as well. And we can call this large items. And so here, uh, we've defined what type large items is, but we haven't yet initialized what actually goes into large items. So we need to instantiate the list. And so we can do large items equals new. And here we can just use an array list. Um, and so this will create a new array list so that large items isn't null. Now moving on, we have these two methods that we need to override, right? One of them looks to be very short and the other looks to be decently long. And so if you remember, LargeFriend implements comparator and iterable. And so it needs to override the methods that are defined in comparable and iterable, right? And if you remember the interface comparator, comparator has a method compare, right? Which takes in two items and outputs which one is larger, right? And the way it does that is it outputs a number. Um, and if the number is positive, that means the first item is bigger. If the number is negative, that means the second item is bigger. And if the number is zero, then that means the two items are the same, right? So in this case, when we're comparing apple and zebra, we're going to get a number less than zero because the second item is larger. In this case, when we're comparing apple with itself, we get number equals zero since the two items are the same. And if there was another case, like down here, when we do fish and chips, num is going to be greater than zero because the first item is bigger than the second item. So looking down here, we're going to have to implement the compare method. And we're also going to have to implement the methods for iterable, right? So remember that iterable is an interface with a iterator method. And the iterator method will return an iterable, and that is used in order to iterate over the objects in LargeFriend that are deemed larger. And so when we're taking a look at iterator, we're just going to return an iterable, and we can get that using the list that we create, right? And so this method is not going to be that long, so we can fill it out in the first half. So let's work on the iterator method first, since it shouldn't be that long. Remember that the iterator method returns an iterable. So we need to put that here. And the method name is iterator. It does not take in any parameters. And we have to return an iterator over the items that we say are larger in LargeFriends. And remember, we were storing that in large items. And so what we can do is we can just return large items dot iterator, right? Because large items itself is a list, it has its own iterator method, right? That's why we're able to use, lists and array lists inside of these for loops, these enhanced for loops, because they actually have their own iterator method as well. And so this will just return an iterable over the items in large items, and that will act as our iterable for LargeFriend. So now that we've implemented the iterator method, we can implement the compare method, right? And the logic for this is going to be a lot longer since we have to do some logic on what the number is, whether the number is bigger than zero or whether the number is less than zero. And so that's why we have all this space here. So the compare method is going to return an integer, like I talked about before, some number. And what are the parameters it's going to take in, right? If we look up here, you can see whenever we call compare, we're taking in two items, right? And then we return some integer. And so the compare method is going to take in two items of type t. So we can call it TA and TB, right? Our large friend comparator is generic with type T. So we're going to have to take in items of type T as well. So now looking at the actual method itself, we're going to use the comparator that we took in as an input in our function, in our constructor, wrapped comparator, right? So remember we set wrapped comparator to be the comparator that we took in as an input. And this is actually what we're going to use in order to compare the objects that we take in, A and B. So let's define a variable to hold the number that comes out as a result of comparing A and B. So we can define an integer number that equals the result of comparing A and B. And remember, we do that with the wrapped comparator, right? Since wrapped comparator is a comparator. So we can do wrapped comparator dot compare A and B. So now, depending on the result of number, we need to do a couple of different things, right? So we have the case where if number is bigger than 0, what does that mean, right? Remember when number was bigger than 0, that means our first item, so A, is going to be larger than B, right? And so we're going to have to add A to our list of larger items, right? Because it was the bigger item of A and B. And so remember our list of larger items was large items. And so we can just do large items uh, dot add. We can just add A. Um, and now we have to consider the other cases as well. If number is bigger than 0, then we should add A to large items. Otherwise, right, if number is less than 0, we should add B instead, right? Because that means B is the bigger item. So we can do if number is less than 0, we can do large items dot add B. If number is equal to 0, then we don't need to add it to our list since no item was deemed larger, right? We didn't add apple to our resulting list because neither item was larger than the other. So we don't need to do anything in the case where number equals 0. And now we can just return num, because remember, for the compare method, we have to return an integer. And so number is just the integer that we got when we compared A and B. So that is the solution to this question.